Hi everyone, Jessica here from Australian Rotary Health. We're here today with Janeen Brian as part of our Australian Rotary Health and QBD Books partnership to lift the lid on mental illness in schools. Janeen is an award-winning children's author and poet with over 100 books published in both trade and educational publishing. She enjoys writing picture books, junior fiction, poetry, novels, and non-fiction. Many of her books have been translated and distributed worldwide, while more than 200 stories, poems, plays, and articles have been published in children's magazines or anthologies. Janeen was the recipient of the 2012 Adelaide Festival of Literature Car-Clue Fellowship, and in 2009 also received a May Gibbs Children's Literature Trust Fellowship. Janeen is an ambassador for Raising Literacy Australia, the Little Big Book Club. She loves reading, creating mosaics, aqua aerobics, yoga, walking, gardening, traveling, craft work, singing, watching theatre and films, and spending time with her family and friends. She lives in the seaside city of Glenelg in Adelaide, South Australia with her husband, and she has 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren. So Janeen, you started out as a teacher and your love of writing became a profession later in life. How different was it to change from a day-to-day schedule to a more creative freedom with a deadline?
Well, first of all, I think being a teacher was a very, very creative way of earning my living and enjoying the profession while I was doing it. But towards sort of the end of my teaching, I was doing part-time. Although I was a permanent teacher, I'd moved into a small school as a teacher librarian, and that sort of was just such a lovely, comfortable, happy place to be. But I knew deep down that if I didn't give writing my all, then I would never know if I was going to make it as a full-time writer. And so in a way I was able to work 3 days at the school, and then having done many, many years of teaching, I was then able to work the part-time for the 3 days, and then I was able to have 2 days where I really became quite disciplined. And I think in a way it sort of eased me into that sort of stage of having an income, having a permanent job, into being able to set myself up. I actually had a room that I could actually make into my office, excuse me, and I wouldn't sort of, I more or less drove myself to make sure that I was up, dressed, ready, and in that room at a certain time. And so by doing that, I think I sort of felt that I was at a job, and it was an important job, and there was no one else to do it but me. And by doing that, I was able to sort of get onto a lot of interesting programs on Google, which gave you particular prompts. In other words, gave you an idea as to what to write for that day without it being what you were writing or what you were researching. It actually sort of spread your mind, spread your ideas, made you think of other things, and challenged you. And that was a really good way to start, with a cup of tea, of course, sitting beside me and a glass of water. So that was sort of how I started my day. And I virtually became quite, I was, and I probably am, quite a disciplined person when needs be. So I made sure that that was something that I took great value for. And then I started sort of, I'd been published before, but I really started searching then for lots and lots more avenues and openings. And as I said, I have this creed where it says, if it's to be, it's up to me. And so I had to, work hard, look for different opportunities, even to the point of writing Christmas greeting card verses or personal verses for people who are having birthdays. It didn't matter. To me, I was still writing that muscle that needed to be exercised. And deadlines to me were simply a sign saying, you can do it, but you've got this amount of time to do it in. And so for some people, it's a very hard thing. They get quite distracted. And I can understand that totally. It just depends, I think, on the type of person you are. I think nowadays, though, having been a full-time writer now for, having written for over 35 years and having been a full-time writer since 1990, I'm sort of eased back a bit. Whereas before I wouldn't do anything if I wasn't writing unless I was going to a library or something connected. These days I am a little bit more lenient, but I'm still involved every day with writing or pursuing some aspect of writing. Yep.
Yeah, well, that's a really great way to approach something that you're so passionate about with, such discipline as well. I guess as well, where does your inspiration come from for your books, and what does that process look like when you're writing them?
Every author will probably tell you the same thing, that you actually become this sort of double identity. You become a Janeen that's a normal everyday Janeen, but you also become this person who is got radar out for every potential story idea that might be floating around. So you eavesdrop, you look at things with different eyes. Someone might see an event happening and might just say, oh, well, that happened. But as a writer, you sort of think, does that have a grain of gold in it? Could it be something that I could use? And to that end, I tend to use little notebooks. So I actually, will try and write things down. I know that a lot of people these days with our phones, we can just press record, or we can make a note of it very quickly if you're in an awkward situation, and you can keep notes and ideas that way. Now, I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of these little booklets. It doesn't necessarily mean that every idea I gather is going to make it into a book or a poem. It means, I think for me, that when I do write, there is this sort of subconscious backlog of stuff that, given the opportunity, will come out. You might not use what you saw or felt or eavesdropped or experienced as a particular story idea. You might, but I think often it comes out because you've put it back in your subconscious. It's been an active experience that you have then, sort of put into your bank of experiences that when you're writing will come out, and far more than if you didn't take yourself out and about and you didn't talk to people and you didn't take notice of things and wonder about things. So the other thing is too that, say for example, there are a couple of aspects when I went overseas. There are a couple of aspects that I came home with, and that came up in this book called Eloise, The Bucket of Stars. And there were just two things that I came back with. It. One was a picture of a unicorn and a weaving in Scotland, and another one was the grimness of some of the early orphanages that I saw in England and Ireland. And they were the 2 points that I put together and created a story. Now, I would never have thought of that, but those two things stayed in my mind. There are other things too, like, say, for example, you might, with this one, Where's Jessie? Where's Jessie came about because I saw an 100-year-old teddy bear at an antique, a show. And it had been sent up to a little child way, way back, up to Alice Springs, and it had travelled some time on a camel. It had been carted on a camel. Those kind of things, interesting to people, but for me, I was able to use it. Little things like photographs of boys who were in the mines in South Australia, the early mines, boys of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, working in these situations. I saw a photograph of them sorting all the ore, and that sparked off an idea as well. And things like that become the passion of it more so than the actual event. So then you start doing the research that's needed, and a lot of my novels have needed research too. So I was just going to see if there was anything else that I wanted to share with that too. Oh yes, as far as reading other people's books also is a great way to get inspiration, because you are traveling with a story, but you can't help but be affected by it. And that can trigger off ideas for yourself as well, not plagiarizing, not copying, just simply, wow, yeah, I'd never thought of that. Or yes, I've been there too. Oh, that's right, I remember I had this experience, or something like that. So things like that are always happening. And I always, wherever I go, I take lots of photos. I always take lots of photos because they're great references and they're great triggers as well. So those kind of things are the ways that I get ideas. Inspiration really, really is hard work. It's just another word for me, is hard work. I call writing hard fun anyway, but I think that it's just, your inspiration is that tiny part of it. It's the rest of it. It's the perspiration, as they say, that is the final thing that you have to work at. And I'm actually doing an edit on a book that I wrote years and years ago, and I'm so enjoying it because I can see how far I've come from just those early writings. So the learning is always there. I tend, when I first start anything, because it's fascinating to talk to other authors because they all do it so differently. I tend to do a lot of brainstorming. I think I've got more of a pictorial sense, so I tend to need to, jot brainstorming and mind mapping down and getting ideas, throwing lots of ideas down before I can actually find a thread or find a beginning or find a voice to the story that I'm going to write. So that's a lot of brainstorming. And then I now tend to write with a pen and paper, because I've read a lot about the benefits of doing that to start with, that it slows the brain down, gives you more chance to think about things, and often is a better outcome before you put it on the computer. And they say that, a computer, sometimes if you put it on the computer, I was going to say whack it on the computer, but that sounds a bit flippant because I know a lot of people can do that. But I find that if I put it on the computer, it stares back at me as if to say, well, that's finished, that's done. And I know it's not. So I'll do it on paper first of all, and then when I feel ready, I'll put it on computer and then print it out and read it, and so on, back and forth, however long it takes. So that's pretty much the brief process, and that goes for poetry as well. Yep.
Yeah, well, that's such an interesting process, and I'm sure many people who are into writing and want to actually publish their work, they could get a lot of great tips from that. So thanks for sharing your process and your inspiration. Now that you have grandchildren, you must love introducing them to your books and reading with them. How vital do you think it is to introduce reading to our kids?
I think there's probably nothing more vital. I quite feel that, and I quite see the results of children who have had early reading. And not just my grandchildren. I have two girls and I have two boys from different daughters. And as I say, we're all very, very different. It's just that the two girls are very immersed in reading and have always loved it. And so that's fabulous. They've had lots of reading. The younger boy, however, is, whenever I pick him up and share stories with him, he loves it. He absolutely loves it, but I'm the one reading to him. So I choose books that I know he'll like and that will extend him as well, because he doesn't tend to read as much at home himself. So because he's got that brain where he's more... he's a superb illustrator. He's 8, but he's very, very good. He's always loved to illustrate and draw. So I bought him one of the younger graphic novels and gave it to him as a special treat. And he's so thrilled because he's finished reading it himself and he's loved it because it's been an illustrative form of fiction. And that is coming back to finding the right book for that child. And so we'll go on from there. So it's, for me, it's just, I think there is just so many benefits of actually reading to children from very, very young ages. Then it's not just the communication and the language and the vocab and the empathy that comes from it. It's that absolute joy of knowing that this is special, it's beautiful, it's the trust of sitting on someone's lap or in their arms and having the words shared with you as something that you can experience together. And I don't think any parent or grandparent or carer who reads to children would ever deny it is such a beautiful experience. And the children who are lucky enough to have that always remember those books. And even at the story time sessions that I was doing today, some of the teacher librarians were talking about the books that they loved and grew up still loving. Such huge importance has been placed on those early experiences of reading. So I think there's just, and we know that, you know, the brain expands in those first 5 years. 90% of our brain develops in that period of time. So if we let it go uneducated or given them spontaneity and experiences like you can get from reading, we're really denying them something that's so very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess just one more question, Janeen. If you could go back in time, would you have started out as a writer? And what would be your one piece of advice to your younger self?
I really enjoyed this question because it's something that I've sort of thought about briefly, but never really considered. And I just feel as though I think perhaps it was better the way it happened. In fact, that I came to be a writer later on. I feel as though I grew into it. I'd always wanted to be a teacher, and so that was very important that I did that. But because because I grew up without books, I didn't have books in a school library. We weren't read to. We were given one reader per year at school, and you had to read it around the class, which is, you know, a good way to kill any enthusiasm. And with no books in the house to speak of, it was a very sort of different kind of experience to what I've been talking about. So I think I didn't really know much about books. I didn't really know anything except the fact that I loved it if ever I heard a story or had a chance to have a book. So I think if I'd tried too early, I think I would have been wallowing, you know, in a fair chasm of sort of emptiness of not knowing what to do. That's not to say I knew immediately what I did need to do. In fact, it's such a long journey because I did miss out on those early years of understanding how a story begins and has its rise and climax and resolution and things like that. It took a long time for me to learn those things, and I actually studied myself. I never went to a college or did many courses or anything like that. I used to use books from the library to learn how to write, and then, as I said earlier, teaching myself from the prompts that came from Google and all sorts of experiences like that. So I think for me, it probably was the right way around that I came to writing later on. And so that, I think that suited me quite happily. Yeah. And as far as the advice that I would give to my younger self, I would say, listen to what people say to you, but then decide what you think. I think for me, whatever anyone else said was always the right thing. And so therefore I took it as gospel. That was what I was supposed to think. And unfortunately, that didn't allow me to grow, I don't think, in my own opinions. And so I think I took a long time to learn that. And I think that's something that I would have said to my youngest self would be just listen to what people say, but then decide very much for yourself on your own values. Let your values grow and let yourself develop as a person.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time today, Janeen. It's been a really great chat with you. And yeah, I hope everything goes well with your new book as well.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. You can support the Lift the Lid in Schools campaign this October by heading into QBD Books in-store or online and buying Janeen's book, Aussie Kids Meet Mia by the Jetty, where $2 from every purchase will be donated to fund children's mental health research.